Right now, somewhere in the Philippine Sea, one of the most powerful warships ever constructed is cutting a slow, deliberate path through gray-green water, its flight deck a city block of controlled chaos, FA-18s cycling through launch sequences, E-2D Hawkeyes tracking contacts across 300 miles of airspace, and below decks, targeting teams running scenarios they have rehearsed for 2 decades, but hoped they would never execute. 40 nautical miles to its northeast, a second carrier strike group, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, holds a parallel track. Between them, they represent more concentrated naval firepower than most nations have ever assembled in a single theater. And yet the tension in those command rooms is not the tension of dominance. It is something quieter and far more dangerous. It is the tension of a threshold. The Luzon Strait, the narrow, contested waterway between the Philippine island of Luzon and Taiwan's southern tip, has been designated by the United States Navy as a maritime enforcement zone. American destroyers are running intercept patrols. Surface action groups from Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force are operating in coordination under bilateral security frameworks. The message, delivered not in words but in hull numbers and flight patterns, is unmistakable. The flow of goods, oil, and military equipment through this passage is no longer guaranteed. Here is what the mainstream media is not telling you: this is not a blockade in the legal sense. Washington has been deliberate about that language. What has been declared is an enhanced maritime security operation, a phrase chosen specifically to avoid the word that would trigger the legal obligations of the UN Charter and give Beijing a cleaner justification for its response. But the effect on the water is identical. Ships are being turned back, Chinese-flagged vessels are being boarded and inspected, and as of 72 hours ago, 2 planned frigates that attempted to escort a commercial convoy through the strait were shadowed at distance by American guided missile destroyers until they reversed course. Here is something that no strategic analyst had fully wargamed in modern history. Not a blockade of China by name, but a blockade by consequence. And China has not yet responded with force. The word yet is doing enormous work in that sentence. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why America chose this moment to lock the Luzon Strait rather than a broader choke point, what China's military options actually are if it decides to break the cordon by force, and why the economic consequences of the next 72 hours will reach the price of goods in your city, regardless of whether a single shot is fired. Stay with me. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to March 2024. That was when the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Plan, completed its most significant naval exercise since 1996, a full-scale rehearsal of joint blockade operations around Taiwan, involving more than 100 surface vessels, submarine units, and land-based missile batteries operating in coordinated sequence for the first time. Western analysts watching the satellite imagery were not surprised by the capability display. They were surprised by the confidence of it. China was no longer rehearsing in ambiguity. It was rehearsing in public, at scale, and on a timeline. The United States had, since 2022, been accelerating arms deliveries to Taiwan under the Foreign Military Sales Program, Harpoon coastal defense systems, HIMARS artillery platforms, and, critically, the first consignment of Volcano anti-ship mine systems designed to complicate any amphibious approach to Taiwan's western shoreline. Beijing had protested through diplomatic channels, then through military communiques, then through the unprecedented step of summoning the American ambassador in Beijing not once but 3 times in a single year. On September 12th of last year, the situation cracked. A Taiwanese Coast Guard vessel and a planned maritime militia ship, a fishing vessel operating under PLA operational command, as dozens of them do, collided in disputed waters northeast of the Pratas Islands. The Taiwanese vessel sank. 3 crew members died. Taiwan's government released intercepts it claimed showed the militia vessel had received instructions from a planned operational command frequency 17 minutes before the collision. China denied it. The United States said the intercepts were credible. The UN Security Council met and accomplished nothing of substance, as it increasingly does when the 2 permanent members with veto power are on opposite sides of the issue. What followed was 6 months of accelerating military positioning that the headlines covered as isolated incidents, but which, when you map them on a timeline, tell a completely different story. By February of this year, the United States had quietly pre-positioned an additional squadron of P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, expanded its rotational marine presence at Subic Bay to roughly 4,200 personnel, and, in a move that received almost no coverage, concluded a classified basing agreement with the Philippines allowing U.S. Navy vessels to use the port facilities at Cagayan de Oro on Mindanao, which sits directly on the southern approach to the Luzon Strait. Japan moved simultaneously. The JMSDF repositioned 2 Atago-class guided missile destroyers, vessels equipped with the SM-3 Block 2IA, the most capable naval ballistic missile interceptor in service, from their home berths at Yokosuka and Sasebo to forward operating positions in Okinawa Prefecture. This was not a deployment. It was a repositioning. The ships had not left their operational theater. They had simply moved closer to where the operational theater was going to be. Beijing saw all of this. Beijing tracked every hull movement, every flight, every port call. And on the morning of April 3rd, the plan conducted what it described as a routine patrol with 8 warships through the Luzon Strait in a formation configuration that American naval analysts immediately recognized as a rehearsal for exactly the kind of convoy escort operation that has now, 3 weeks later, become the flashpoint. The timeline makes the current moment not a surprise. It makes it inevitable in retrospect. The blockade, or the Enhanced Maritime Security Operation, if you prefer Washington's careful language, did not emerge from a single decision. It emerged from 2 years of escalating threshold testing, in which both sides moved incrementally closer to a line that neither formally acknowledged existed until one side crossed it. That threshold has now been crossed. Let us now examine what military strategists are actually saying about China's options in the Luzon Strait, because this is where the public conversation has been almost entirely missing the operational reality. The plan is not the Navy it was in 2010, or in 2015, or even in 2020. Between 2019 and 2024, China launched more naval tonnage than the entire current Royal Navy. It now operates 3 aircraft carriers, with a 4th under construction at Jiangnan Shipyard. Its Type 055 destroyer, the Renhai class, is by most measurements the most capable surface combatant in the Pacific after American carriers themselves, equipped with the YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile with a range of roughly 290 miles and a terminal supersonic sprint phase that makes interception significantly more complicated than older sea-skimming systems. But here's the precise military question that keeps Pacific command planners awake at night. The Luzon Strait is 230 miles wide at its narrowest point. That sounds like a lot of water. It is not a lot of water in terms of weapons physics. China has the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, what strategists call a carrier killer, with a range of approximately 900 miles, deployed on mobile launchers in Fujian province, pointing directly at the current American carrier positions. It has the DF-26B, range 2,500 miles, which can reach Guam, and it has the YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship missile deployed on H-6K bombers currently sitting at bases in Guangdong province, 40 minutes flight time from the Strait. The scenario that military planners distinguish from the headline scenario is this. China does not need to physically break the blockade by sending surface ships through the patrol line. It has 3 other options, each with distinct escalatory signatures. Option 1 is the submarine option. China currently operates 6 Type 094 ballistic missile submarines and 12 Type 093 attack submarines. 2 of those attack boats were tracked by American P-8s 2 weeks ago, operating in the deep water channel northeast of Luzon, what the Navy calls the Philippine Basin, and then lost. Losing a contact in ASW operations is not unusual. Losing it for 72 hours in a contested zone during a crisis is something else. If China moves a submarine through the blockade line submerged, it has technically broken the cordon without a visible surface confrontation. The political ambiguity is intentional. Option 2 is the missile demonstration option. Not a strike, a demonstration. Firing a DF-21D into an open ocean impact zone precisely positioned to fall inside the American patrol area without hitting any vessel is a message that requires no translation. It says, I can reach you at any time. And my decision not to has been voluntary. This is not a theoretical escalation. China used a version of this in August 2022, firing DF-15 missiles into the waters around Taiwan in 5 designated impact zones. The logic is the same. Option 3 is the most strategically complex and the one that analysts discuss most privately. China imposes its own counter-blockade, not in the Luzon Strait, but in the Taiwan Strait itself, declaring a maritime exclusion zone under the legal framework of military exercises, as it did in 2022, and daring Taiwan and the United States to challenge it. This creates a second theater, forces American naval resources to make a choice about prioritization, and allows Beijing to frame the confrontation as reciprocal rather than aggressive. What changed, the genuine tactical development that breaks all prior precedent, is the integration of these 3 options under a single command and control framework. PLA doctrine since 2015 has pursued what it calls multi-domain precision warfare, the simultaneous coordination of space, cyber, electronic warfare, and kinetic options in a single operational envelope. American war games at the RAND Corporation and the Naval War College have consistently found that the U.S. military's decision cycle, the time required to identify, assess, and authorize a response, is longer than the window China's integrated strike systems would require to act. That gap has not closed. It has widened. The weapons exist. The doctrine exists. The question is entirely whether political leadership in Beijing makes the decision to use them. Now let us talk about what this means for your economy, because this is not abstract geopolitics. This is a direct line from American destroyers in the Luzon Strait to the price of gasoline, electronics, and food on the shelves in your city. Within 48 hours of the first public confirmation that American vessels had turned back Chinese flagged ships at the Strait, oil markets moved. Brent crude, which had been trading in the 82 per barrel range, pushed to $97 per barrel in a single session, the largest single-day move since the first days of the Russia-Ukraine war in February 2022. By the second day, it had touched $103. Those numbers matter not just as data points, but as triggers. 100 per barrel oil activates automatic cost escalation clauses in roughly 40% of long-term shipping contracts worldwide. The Luzon Strait is not the Strait of Hormuz. It does not carry the same volume of tanker traffic, but it carries something arguably more sensitive in the current supply chain environment. Approximately 88% of all container traffic between Northeast Asian manufacturing centers, China, South Korea, Japan, and their markets in Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and East Africa passes through or near the Luzon-Taiwan corridor. The alternative routing, around the eastern coast of the Philippines and through the Celebes Sea, adds 3 to 5 days to most voyages and increases fuel costs by 18 to 22% per transit. Shipping rates on the Asia-Pacific spot market, measured by the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index, rose 34% in the first 72 hours after the incident went public. To translate that into supply chain language, if you are a retailer in Germany, the United States, or Australia who locked in contracted shipping rates 6 months ago, you are protected for now. If you are negotiating a new contract today, you are paying dramatically more for a route that carriers are increasingly reluctant to take at any price. The downstream industries most directly exposed are not the ones you might expect. The most vulnerable sector is not finished electronics, though that matters. It is semiconductor equipment. Taiwan produces roughly 63% of the world's advanced chips and over 90% of chips below 7 nanometers, the kind used in AI systems, advanced military hardware, and flagship smartphones. The equipment required to maintain and expand that production, ASML lithography machines from the Netherlands, precision chemicals from Japan, specialty gases from South Korea, all moves through or near the Luzon-Taiwan corridor. A sustained disruption does not shut down TSMC next week. It creates a depletion clock that runs out in months, not years. Japan is the most acutely exposed advanced economy. Japan holds approximately 167 days of oil import reserves, a number that sounds comfortable until you factor in that Japanese industrial production requires consistent, just-in-time energy inputs, and that roughly 62% of Japan's LNG imports transit routes that have now been reclassified as high risk by insurers in the Lloyd's of London market. War risk premiums on that LNG traffic have already increased by a factor of 3. India holds an estimated 20 to 25 days of net crude import cover in strategic reserves, a figure that has not significantly improved since the pandemic. India's refinery complex is designed around Saudi and Iraqi crude grades, much of which transits the Indian Ocean and Malacca Strait without using the Luzon corridor, which provides a partial buffer. But Indian electronics manufacturing, a sector New Delhi has invested heavily in developing as a China Plus One alternative, depends on components moving through the exact supply chain now under pressure. South Korea's exposure is among the most severe of any major economy. Korea imports 100% of its crude oil and holds approximately 106 days of strategic petroleum reserves. But its semiconductor industry, which accounts for 17% of total export revenue, operates in deep integration with Taiwanese and Chinese supply chains. Samsung and SK Hynix have been working for 2 years to diversity their chemical supply inputs, but that process is measured in years, not quarters. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from American destroyers in the Luzon Strait to the price of your smartphone replacement, your electric vehicle battery, and the semiconductor content of the car you drive. Every advanced manufactured product you own has a Taiwan-adjacent supply chain fingerprint. This crisis is not about Taiwan. It is about the industrial substrate of the modern world. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed, because what comes next in this story is moving faster than the news cycle can process it. Now let us examine the diplomatic chessboard, because the military and economic pressure is operating in parallel with a diplomatic channel that is both more active and more fragile than the public picture suggests. The United States has been communicating with China through 3 simultaneous channels. The official channel, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and the Chinese Embassy in Washington, is conveying the formal positions. Washington maintains that the operation is consistent with international maritime law, that it is a response to what it characterizes as Chinese gray zone coercion against Taiwan, and that it does not constitute an act of war. Beijing's formal response insists that the operation violates China's sovereign rights and the One China framework, and demands an immediate cessation. Those public positions are approximately as informative as 2 poker players announcing they have good hands. The second channel is the military-to-military hotline between Pacific Command in Hawaii and the PLA's Southern Theater Command, which was re-established in November 2023 after an 18-month suspension. That line has been active. What is being said on it is not public. But the fact that it is being used, that neither side has gone silent in the way that preceded the most dangerous moments of the 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis, is itself a data point that analysts note cautiously and carefully. The third channel is the one that should command your attention. Oman, which has historically served as a back channel between adversaries who cannot be seen talking to each other, dispatched its foreign minister to both Washington and Beijing within 96 hours of the Strait incident going public. Oman hosted the secret talks that led to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. It brokered the first direct U.S.-Iran prisoner exchange in a decade. It is not sending its foreign minister on a routine diplomatic tour. Oman is carrying a message, or perhaps two messages, and the content of those messages will determine whether this crisis resolves or escalates. China's domestic political constraints are the variable that outside analysts most consistently underestimate. President Xi Jinping cannot publicly back down from a confrontation that state media has already framed as American aggression against Chinese interests. The domestic audience has been primed over years to expect firmness. The gap between what Beijing can say publicly and what it might accept privately is wider than at any point in the past 3 decades. And that gap is where every off-ramp to this crisis must be constructed. The Gulf states are watching with a calculation that is purely economic. A protracted confrontation in the Luzon Strait, which drives oil prices above $110 per barrel, generates approximately $140 billion in additional annual revenue for the GCC countries at current production levels. That is not a reason to want the confrontation. It is a reason to not be especially urgent about ending it. Turkey has offered, through a statement that was notably specific in its offer of technical facilitation capacity, to host any multilateral talks. No one has taken Turkey up on this yet, but the offer is in the public record for a reason. Let us now examine the 3 scenarios that analysts are modeling, because certainty here is not available to anyone, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. The first scenario is a negotiated resolution. This requires, at minimum, 4 things happening simultaneously. The United States agrees to suspend the enhanced maritime security operation in exchange for a Chinese commitment to a formal moratorium on gray zone operations in Taiwan's contiguous zone. Taiwan agrees to delay the next scheduled volcano mine system delivery. A multilateral maritime incident protocol, something like a naval equivalent of the 1972 INCESIA agreement, is agreed in principle, and both sides accept a face-saving formula that allows each to describe the outcome to its domestic audience as a form of victory. This is possible. The conditions for it exist. But it requires both leaderships to make politically costly concessions simultaneously, and the timing problem is severe. Every day that carrier strike groups remain in confrontation posture is a day that an accident, a miscalculation, a system failure, a junior officer making a decision his superiors would not have made, can remove the choice from the hands of the decision makers entirely. The second scenario is continued attrition. The blockade that is not named a blockade holds for weeks or months. China does not use force but conducts systematic gray zone operations in response, harassment of Philippine fishing vessels, additional missile tests in the South China Sea, cyber operations against Taiwanese critical infrastructure, and sustained diplomatic pressure on countries that have not taken a public position. The economic costs accumulate. Oil stays above 95. Shipping insurance rates remain elevated. The semiconductor supply chain begins showing stress indicators. This scenario is probably the most likely near-term trajectory. It has no natural endpoint. It ends when one side decides the cost of continuation exceeds the cost of either escalation or compromise. And both of those calculations are deeply uncertain. The third scenario is the one that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. China determines that the political cost of continued perceived capitulation exceeds the military risk of a single, sharply bounded kinetic response. It selects a target that is military, not civilian, most likely a U.S. Navy P-8 conducting maritime patrol in international airspace near the Strait, or a surface vessel that it can characterize as having entered waters Beijing claims as internal. It conducts the strike, and then it stops. It does not continue. It holds, and it waits to see whether Washington escalates or negotiates. The logic of this scenario, which is sometimes called compellence escalation in the strategic literature, is that a single kinetic act, carefully bounded and immediately followed by a public offer to negotiate, creates a moment of forced decision for the United States in which the costs and risks of military escalation must be weighed against the humiliation of de-escalation. China's calculation, if it makes this calculation, that would be that the United States, facing a midterm political environment and a public with no appetite for a Pacific war, would choose negotiation. That calculation might be correct. It might also be catastrophically wrong. And the historical record of compellence strategies, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Korean War armistice negotiations, does not provide reassurance that bounded escalation stays bounded. The moment a P-8 or a destroyer takes a hit, the U.S. Congress authorizes something. And once it is authorized, controlling what it authorizes is no longer fully in the hands of the executive. This is the scenario that strategic analysts discuss privately in terms that would not be printable in a mainstream news article. Let us now bring this home in the most direct way I can. Watch the Baltic Dry Index. Watch the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index. Watch the 10-year Japanese government bond yield. These three numbers will tell you in real time what the actual risk assessment of this crisis looks like. Not the version in the press release, but the version that professional money is pricing. Here's the direct line from a Strait you may have never heard of before this week to your daily life. The electronics you are watching this video on contain chips that pass through Taiwan's fabrication ecosystem. The car you drive, even if it was manufactured in your home country, contains dozens of semiconductor components that trace their origin to the supply chain now under pressure. The food prices in your city are partially set by the cost of nitrogen-based fertilizer, which requires energy inputs, which are priced off global LNG markets, which are now in crisis premium. The consumer credit rate on any loan you take out in the next 6 months will reflect the risk repricing that bond markets are conducting this week. And the pension or retirement savings you may have, if they hold any Asian equity exposure, have already moved. This is what geopolitical events mean in a world of integrated supply chains. There is no such thing as a regional conflict in the Luzon Strait. There is only a local trigger and a global transmission mechanism, and the transmission is faster than the headlines. The Luzon Strait that existed before April 3rd, an open, contested but navigable waterway that most of the world's container ships and tankers transited without incident, is not coming back in the form it had. Whatever resolution emerges from this crisis, the routing calculations of shipping companies, the insurance premiums of Lloyd's syndicates, and the capital allocation models of semiconductor supply chain planners have already been permanently recalibrated. The cost of this will be paid whether or not another shot is fired. Here is something that the headlines are not telling you. The most consequential decision of this crisis may not be made in Washington or Beijing. It may be made in Taipei, specifically whether Taiwan's government decides to accelerate, delay, or publicly announce its next major American arms delivery. That announcement and its timing changes the domestic political calculus in Beijing in ways that either open or close the window for the Omani back channel to function. And as of the writing of this script, that decision has not been made. That is the genuine open question. Not whether America and China go to war. The overwhelming weight of evidence still suggests both sides want to avoid that outcome. But whether the institutional, political, and military momentum that has been building for 2 years in this corridor has already moved beyond the point where individual decision makers can reliably steer it. Whether the system is now running faster than the people nominally in charge of it, that is not a question this video can answer. It is a question that the next several weeks will answer, and we will be watching every development and breaking it down in exactly this way. Not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, with the data, the military analysis, and the economic transmission mechanisms that connect what happens in a strait most people couldn't locate on a map to the price of everything in your world. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.